Happy Thanksgiving. I'm going to talk today about Plato on tyranny. We've talked about different forms of government. The best, in his opinion, is aristocracy, rule by the best. The second best is timocracy. That is to say, rule by those who are driven by honor and shame, who seek the honor and esteem of their fellow citizens. At least they're directed, if not by reason, by the reason of others, by the concerns and interests of others. Then, below that, is oligarchy, rule by the wealthy. It's not nearly as good. The rich can't be counted on to act in the public interest. Nevertheless, it can get worse. And he thinks democracy is even worse. Not only because it has a tendency to be ruled by the mob, but also because it tends to devolve. It is highly unstable because different classes emerge in the state. They're the idle and spendthrift, he says, those who essentially devote themselves to the pursuit of pleasure. There are those who are hardworking, save, and industrious, and those people succeed quite well. And then there's the mass of people who are not able to succeed all that well. They are better off than in some other forms of government, but on the other hand, they really don't have much of a stake. They can't develop enough prosperity to indulge themselves in luxuries, and they can't set aside enough to really feel successful. So they tend to feel left out. They tend to feel forgotten. In theory, they have real power in a democracy. They're able to vote. But on the other hand, they're really not able to put themselves in a position where they feel as if their interests are being represented. So he says, they tend to look for a populist leader, a leader who is going to stand for the forgotten person. And they generally can find it. Somebody's going to emerge to take on that role and speak out for those who are not really able, because of their position in society, to speak out for themselves. Now, it might be that that popular leader succeeds and actually is able to direct the state more toward the interests of the body of the people, in which case the situation can be stabilized, at least for a while. More often, however, powerful interests, the interests of the other two classes, combine to destroy that popular leader, to try to convict him of crimes, real or imaginary, to try to drive him into exile, or at least out of politics altogether. And they usually succeed. However, it might be that that popular leader, in order to stop them from prevailing, turns into a tyrant himself, begins to actually use violence against those who would destroy that populist movement. And if that happens, that populist leader tends to become a tyrant. That's not the only way in which it can happen, however. If the other two classes manage to predominate and drive that populist leader into exile, then the people essentially have a choice. They can either opt for a more extreme leader who will use violence to defend their interests, or it will turn out that the powers that be, those who represent the wealthy, those who represent those who are pursuing pleasure, those people are going to gang up and start using violence against their opponents. In either case, if the situation is not stabilized through the success of the populist leader, it turns out that a tyrant takes over. Either the populist leader himself becomes a tyrant, or someone representing the other classes, but nominally claiming to be for the interests of the common people, emerges and becomes tyrannical. Now, what exactly happens when someone becomes a tyrant? Well, one thing is, they begin to use violence against their political opponents. They begin to turn the instruments of the state, the instruments of justice, the things that are supposed to be impartial in the state and representing the interests of the state as a whole, the community as a whole, and the people individually, those get turned against political opponents. So one thing is that the instruments of justice in the state, the institutions of justice, become institutions of injustice, directed against those who would oppose the tyrant. Another thing that happens is that the tyrant typically cancels debts. Now, Plato says that's maybe initially surprising, but what is happening here is, for one thing, it burnishes the populist credentials of the tyrant on the part of anybody who actually owes money, so they become more attached to the leader. It does something else. It works against the interests of those who have loaned the money in the first place. It creates a huge moral hazard, because what it does is begin to break down the moral standard the moral obligation, for example, to keep one's promises. Now, initially you might think that's a bad thing for a tyrant to do, and it may well be from the point of view of the community at large. But on the other hand, the tyrant intends to break moral norms, and so breaking down moral norms in this way is actually to the advantage of the tyrant. So it's not just to gain popularity that the tyrant will do this. The moral degradation, the breaking down of the sense that you actually ought to honor your commitments, that you ought to keep your promises, you ought to pay your debts. That's part of the game. You want to destroy those moral norms if you're a tyrant who intends to transgress them yourself. What else does the tyrant do? Well, typically redistributes property, begins redistributing property to some extent from those who have to those who don't have, in the name of the people, trying to maintain popular support. But all too often it turns out that that's not really the way the transfer goes. It goes from those without power to people who are more powerful, to the tyrant himself, to his own family, to his friends, to his political allies. And so often what happens here is a kind of twofold redistribution. There is the nominal redistribution of wealth to the people to try to maintain popular support, but that's usually relatively insignificant. What's much more significant in terms of the quantities of money involved are the tyrant's own advantageous transfers to himself, to his buddies, to his family, to his political allies. And so there is an appearance of a downward transfer of wealth from those who have to those who have not, but in practice, the main transfer is actually going up from those who have a little to those who have more, and in particular from those who have anything to those who have real political power, as a result of their affiliation with the tyrant. The last thing the tyrant tends to do to unify the people, because after all, the tyrant's in a dangerous position here, trying to appear to be on the side of the people, but usually without really being, certainly if it's the representative of those other two classes who have destroyed the populist leader. They're not on the side of the people, but they have to appear to be. So they have to find some way of unifying those classes. They really represent the interests of the pleasure-seeking class and the wealthier class, but they want to appear to represent the people at large. So what they have to do is unify these groups in some way, and the best way to do that is to declare an enemy. Now, it can be an internal enemy, though that's risky because it's divisive. So usually the political opposition is painted as some kind of internal enemy, and some external enemy is also identified. Often this tyrant will start a war precisely to unify the people against that exterior enemy. And often the people who are the interior enemies, the political opposition, those people will be declared to be somehow on the side of that enemy outside the country. And so some foreign enemy will be identified, and then the political opposition will be accused of being in league with that political enemy on the outside, that other foreign power. The tyrant in these ways cements his control, cements his power over the society at large. The tyrant manages to unify the people at least long enough to assert and assume complete power. Well, the result of all this is that the tyrant begins to purge the city of anyone who opposes him, driving them out, often encouraging them to leave. People flee. And the result of that, Plato says, is that the best tend to flee. They tend to get out of there, or they're forced out. They're imprisoned, they are even killed. And the worst stay around. So the tyrant is surrounded by the worst people in society. Friedrich Hayek in The Road to Serfdom has a chapter entitled Why the Worst Rise to the Top. There are systems, like this tyrannical system, where the worst people rise to the top. The worst people end up being closely associated with the tyrant. The best people are either oppressed or get out. And so the result of all that is that increasingly the tyrant is surrounded by people who are mean-spirited, who are immoral, who are incompetent, who demand more, and so more and more of the state's resources are directed toward supporting the tyrant, supporting his political allies, and not being put to work for the interests of the people, for the interests of the state at large. Consequently, we've got a situation where things seem to get worse and worse in material terms. Often, the tyrant initially will institute reforms that seem to be making things better for the people. But it doesn't last. Within a relatively short time, it becomes clear that this is a worse situation for almost everybody.